All right, so in this short presentation, I want to just outline the areas of interest that I have lately in images as repositories of meaning. And so some of this will be kind of informal and loose and vague. Some of it I'll try to drill down on and get more precise. But I think these are the directions that I think we should be going in. And I think in philosophy, it's, kind of clear that the 20th century and into the 21st century has been dominated by an interest in language. And that makes sense, whether it's the positivists of the Vienna Circle or later Wittgenstein, or even the structuralists and the post-structuralists. The interest in philosophy has been largely focused on language. Sometimes it's even referred to as the linguistic turn. And it's either going to be the propositional sort of elemental components of language, as I think the positivists were mostly concerned with, or it's the larger holistic view of language in the form of discourse and power, which is the kind of thing that Foucault and all the sort of subsequent sort of post-structuralists have been interested in. All of that's fine and good. Perfectly good philosophy was done and is being done in this area of language. My own view is that I think images used to be fairly important in philosophy, and they during that linguistic period, which we're still in, images fell by the wayside and need to be re-examined as repositories of meaning and as some of the most embodied forms of communication. So I want to do kind of a quick sketch of some of the phylogenetic or evolutionary sort of research that's happening in imagery, and look at developmental stuff, and then also look at issues of semantics later on in this presentation. So one of the things that's fairly common is certainly up until about, I would say, 10 years ago, it was fairly common to think that there was a sort of a cognitive revolution that occurred in the development of Homo sapiens, and that cognitive revolution could be seen and tracked by the appearance in the archaeological record of images like cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet, and the creation of figurines, and also, sort of an explosion of Acheulean stone technology, and, the sort of leap that occurred from this long stretch of Olawan stone tools, the stone axe, which sort of doesn't change for over 1 million years, to suddenly much finer equipment. So that view held sway for quite a long time, and I think more recently the idea of a cognitive revolution is being challenged and possibly even overcome by a gradualist view. So let me just hit a couple of high points here. The oldest known examples of writing date back to around 3,400 BC in ancient Sumeria, present-day Iraq. Obviously, the Chauvet cave art goes way back to 35,000 years ago. And the question is, how did images function and emerge and also evolve? Images furnish the mind with thinking tools. That's my sort of basic orientation. I think that if we were going to tell an adaptational story about images, we would need to talk about what advantage they gave us in terms of tools. And so the cognitive revolution idea then in imagery, as I said, connected to cave art, gets pushed back further and further as we find more of this kind of artwork. So the Sulawesi pigs are the oldest known figurative or representational art, and that is 45,000 years ago. And we just really revised this date, back to 45,000 years ago. This just happened recently, like in the last 5 years. And so here's an image that you see. This hunting scene is, to our knowledge, currently the oldest. Here I'm quoting Aubert et al. From 2019. Quote, "This hunting scene is, to our knowledge, currently the oldest pictorial record of storytelling and the earliest figurative artwork in the world." So this pig you've probably seen, it was sort of splashed everywhere when it was first discovered a few years ago. And one interesting question I have right away is whether this is storytelling, and in what sense images are storytelling. Do they have to be in juxtaposition with other images? What is the part and what is the whole when you're looking at cave art? That is not obvious. It may seem obvious, but I don't think it is. So that's one question we have. The cognitive gradualist view, and here I'm a huge fan of philosopher Kim Sterelny in Australia, and in general, his view about human cultural evolution is one that I find congenial. But this cognitive gradualism suggests that actually the development of image making, or by extension, tool making, spreads out, develops slowly in one region, and then gets reintroduced back into the earlier geographical zone or a new geographical zone, and therefore looks like it's kind of explosive. But in fact, what you're looking at is just the emergence of a slow tinkering kind of process of image making that then arrives seemingly fully formed in a new area. As Dietrich Stout says, there is no reason anymore to see figurative art as a key indicator of a broader package of modern traits. Here, I think we have this general idea that the so-called cognitive explosion may just be the sudden arrival in Europe of human groups who gradually honed their skills elsewhere. So the idea that this pig, which is drawn beautifully in Sulawesi, is a sort of, it's not what we expected. We thought that this artwork developed in Europe and then spread out, and here you have it occurring in Asia and then being introduced or reintroduced back into Europe. So that's a fairly interesting point. Here on the slide, you're seeing it's fairly distorted and hard to make out. So I did a subsequent drawing of this to try to show you what we're looking at with the Sulawesi imagery. And one of the things that archaeologists have noticed is the therianthropes. And the therianthropes comes from the Greek word therion, which means a wild animal or beast, and anthropos, of course, which means human being. And so these are thought to be shapeshifters of some kind, part human, part other animal. Here you see an image of them, and if you look on the left-hand side, you see it in situ with the anoa, which is like a dwarf buffalo. And you see at the front of this dwarf buffalo these little stick figures. And so I blew them up, and on the right-hand side, I redrew them so you can see them better. This is strange. These appear to be hybrid creatures. You could easily interpret them as just bad drawings, but that's not consistent with how good the other animal forms are in this artwork. And so it seems more reasonable to read them as intentional distortions, as intentional hybrids of some kind. It's a little speculative, but it seems reasonable. And you can see here that you've got sort of creatures that have, the top half looks like another animal, and the bottom half looks, the top half looks like human, and the bottom half looks like other animals. And in other work, I've tried to look at this idea of the hybrid. I was influenced to some extent by Dan Sperber's work on supernatural beings and how they travel well as sticky memes, and sort of an epidemiology of these sort of hybrid mashup creatures. And so that issue still interests me greatly, because it suggests that you're using zoological imagery. I'm not even going to say zoological categories because that presupposes a sort of cognitive taxonomy that may or may not be there in early humans, but certainly kind of zoological perceptions, let's put it that way. When you have a hybrid creature, the artist is basically taking one perception of one animal and another, and pasting them together. And this, I think, is really important because it's probably the earliest kind of grammar that we see in the imagination. And for me, that's very exciting. Obviously, later when you have speech and you have language, we're doing the same thing, with other kind of stuff too, recursion and so forth. But I think the same thing can be applied to imagery as well. And there's some interesting work that went on here in terms of music. Stephen Mithen did this by showing, look, you have the elements that Chomsky and others said, appear in language, recursion, embedded clauses, and so forth, also occurring in music. And I would want to argue that this is very much true in imagery too, but I've seen very little work on this, honestly. And I think in terms of archaeological evidence, there's every reason to think we should be looking at images for this because it could well be the predecessor to language and music. All right, so these shapeshifters really interest me. I'm very interested in pre-representational abstraction. Here, we saw that representational artwork of the pigs and stuff goes back to maybe 45,000 years ago, but look at this stuff. These markings, these hash marks, are 73,000 years ago in South Africa, and we see these in other areas too that sort of precede representational work. And the question is, what are they? Are they decorative marks? That's one possibility. Are they ownership marks of some kind? Are they clan or tribal marks? Or are they spiritual or shamanistic marks? And here I'm quoting Christopher Stewart Henshelwood. What they could do with symbols is, for the first time, store information outside of the human brain. And that is a major advance. And I also find that fairly exciting and interesting and something to keep track of. Now, here's an interesting map of human evolution. Every few months, this is getting changed and updated and altered. But humans today are related in the L haplogenetic group, leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago. And did this very small group have a common pictorial culture? That's a very interesting question for me. Do pictorial conventions, the way in which we draw, are they emerging spontaneously in different areas in the old world? Or are they, in fact, all descended from a common culture of pictorial representation? And as far as I know, we have no resolution on this or even clear consensus on this. And this seems very exciting to me. I'm going to come back to it here in a moment. But here, look at, this kind of map coming out of Africa. If you look at this orange stream and down into Southeast Asia and to down under. And then sort of back again. If you look at sort of this around 70 to 65,000 years ago, you see it emerge back into Europe. And this is how I think the archaeological record, this is the sort of trajectory that it's revealing about image making. But of course, this could be changed depending on what we find. Now, are these markings that go back to 70,000 years, are they abstract symbols or are they just naive representations? Again, seems like that would be obvious, and yet it isn't. In other words, are the creators of these images bad at drawing, or is this conceptually sophisticated work that's not interested in representing physical objects out in the world? That's a huge difference. It's going from being like really sort of cognitively or conceptually unsophisticated to being way more sophisticated than we imagined. So are the images, in fact, about something in the environment, or are they representing something about unseen spiritual divinities, which would be obviously a huge difference in terms of cognitive power and so forth. So here, a quick detour into ontogeny and the development of image-making capacities. On the left-hand side, you see shape-making, and all children engage in this early on, and even some primates, notoriously some chimps, have been very good at this and really enjoy just using the arm in a sort of motor skill with crayons to create these shapes. And they don't seem to be, it seems to be more of a locomotion exercise that's probably pleasing and producing interesting connections between, visual perception and motor skills. And so maybe arguably you're looking at the development of a mirror neuron connection, but what maybe somebody like Cecilia Hayes would call a matching vertical association between the perception of color and shape and the actual hand motions. And so we're looking at sort of hand-eye coordination wiring. So, if what fires together wires together, that process of shape making might be very much a Hebbian process. And then next to that, to the right, you see tadpole humans. This infinitely charming process is something that I've seen my own son do, and I think many people have seen their kids do, where you have a kind of a head and then these elongated appendages, almost just, it seems almost, negligent, these bodies. And yet it's unclear what's happening here, but it does seem to be a common developmental pattern, and that is also true cross-culturally. Children start to engage in more controlled shape making, repeating forms and geometric marks. This is followed by this, the tadpole stuff, these blobs you're seeing on the right-hand side. It's unclear whether these representational drawings are an attempt at realism or iconic representation. Many people's drawing ability does not advance beyond this stage, but not because of a cognitive or motor deficit. Rather, once language becomes more efficient as a communication tool, advancing, to draw requires a way more practice and training. And for those who do not continue image making, we see many stages of increased representation. For those who do continue image making, we see many stages of increased representational ability. It's sort of a dance of perceptual and conceptual imaginative power, well mixed with social cultural learning. The shape making that lies under art involves aesthetics, but it comprises something more. It's sort of the hidden, I'm suggesting, what are the hidden structures of mind, the mental filters, categories that dictate how we experience the world. All right, so that's just was a brief detour into ontogenetic development. There's obviously a much bigger story to be told there, but back again to these more evolutionary considerations. I'm very intrigued by the work of Genevieve von Petzinger. And von Petzinger just recently, she's written some very interesting papers and a book recently looking at the sort of symbols that you find in European cave art. And it was kind of shocking that she discovered what a finite number of these geometric signs exist in Europe. And then she continued this work by looking at the markings in the Americas, in India, in China, in Australia. And generally speaking, if we could just sort of confine it to Europe for a moment, you've got a grand total of 32 geometric designs. And that's pretty exciting because it suggests a kind of consistency of symbols. What that means is unclear. Again, is it a common, conserved cultural set of innovations? Or is there something even, that's innate here? Here I'm rather more doubtful. I'm more of an empiricist about this kind of thing, but let's not bracket it out entirely. And so this is something I would like to understand better. A writing system is very difficult to sustain for prehistoric humans, and there's no need for it in small groups of like 50 people. You can just tell everyone what needs to be communicated. So writing really emerges around the time of urbanization or greater collective communities. So really around 5,000 years ago, writing emerges as rules and laws and structures for taxation, etc. So in city-states, it's worth it to expend the energy to create and sustain writing. The social context, I think, is very important for understanding this. So then why are these what looks like proto-writing, why are they there so much earlier? And, one sort of thesis is that I think von Petziger asks, are these some kind of ancient emojis, which makes me laugh. If you look at, we do use emojis in a way as a kind of stand-in to convey a lot of information very quickly with just a face. And oftentimes here the information has an affective or emotional aspect to it, and I find that very telling. So all right, what are the geometrical signs that she finds in Ice Age Europe? And here's, on the right-hand side, you see the master sort of list of these. The asterisk is very common. You'll see this crosshatch or hashtag is one of the oldest and one of the most common symbols. Now, she doesn't think that this is actually a language, and I can't say that I entirely understand the argument, but somehow she thinks it's much too small a set of symbols for it to be a language. But it strikes me that certainly proto-language would be a lot simpler than language, and so why wouldn't this just be an example of a very early proto-language? In any case, I'm very interested, obviously, in these symbols too, and what we can make of them. Is this evidence of inner imagination or perceptual affordances and mimicry? So here's the hashtag on the left-hand side, and some are suggesting this is the Neanderthal hashtag, Gibraltar 40,000 years ago. Now that's exciting. Is it a sign that these cousins of ours or even early Homo sapiens are having a rich inner imaginative life? Or are they, in fact, simply replicating a perception that they have of an object that they may be carrying around with them? So, for example, many people have suggested that somehow Homo sapiens must have had inner representational ideas about stone tools, and then they passed those down to their offspring. You can pass this down horizontally across the tribe, but also vertically from, parents to offspring. And this suggests that they are able to hold the image of a stone tool in their mind and then realize that by carving it into a rock. And my own view is that's not clear. It could be entirely the case that people carried these with them and simply treated the object, the Oldowan stone tool, as a template. In other words, you hold it up, you look at it, you find another rock, and you basically try to recreate it based on the rock tool that you have before you. So in the same way that, tribes would have carried fire before they knew how to make it, you could well have carried cultural implements and recreated them without having a whole lot of internal mental imagery involved in sort of intervening in that process. So that's an interesting question that I have, and that seems like, again, I don't see much literature on this. Question of symbol universalism here is interesting. Again, I'm sort of skipping around and coming back to things in a bit fairly informal way here, but this question, again, I'm just sort of restating it. Is it evidence when you find these images all over Europe and even crossing, the Atlantic or the Pacific? One wonders: is this a common cultural ancestor that has retained image making, or is it a common cognitive translation of nature? In other words, if you put human beings which have the same sort of universal perceptual cognitive baseline into all kinds of new environments, is that baseline set of categories and perceptual and cognitive abilities going to interpret the environment the same because the environment is the same, or has certain features: trees, mountains, rivers, open water? And when that stuff meets a common perceptual cognitive system that has evolved, it's going to produce sort of common imagery or symbols. That's an alternative view. So, there's some interesting scholarship on this. Why is it that the outrigger, if you think about a canoe, the outrigger, it seems to have evolved in different places. And that's when you have a canoe that is stabilized by attaching a smaller canoe to it. So you've seen this before when you have a canoe and then you have these little branching lines that come out horizontally from the side of the canoe and then attach to a much smaller canoe. That's a stabilizer. And what's interesting is that seems to have evolved independently in lots of different island type communities. And so one argument could be, that's what's going to happen when human beings live on islands. They're just naturally going to find a physics solution to the instability of moving around, in the water. Another is, what about genetic deep grammar of images? If there's a kind of genetically engraved deep grammar for language, as the Chomskyites suggest, then why not one for images too? And then obviously much more speculative are sort of Jungian ideas about collective unconscious archetypes, and this is a really interesting one, especially when I think about dreams. When you think about all human beings collect, independently, individually and culturally engage in dreaming, and that cultures evolve around that. And you could argue that this is one of the earliest forms of decoupling, where perceptual images are now able to live and thrive and sort of exist offline in the dream world. And does that itself produce a kind of common imagery that all human beings can share because of the way in which mental imagery in dreams are processed? That does seem to me interesting, and if that has a Jungian dimension, so be it. If not, it's still quite interesting. All right, intentional mark making, but what were the intentions? So in the early 20th century, French prehistorian Henri Bruel suggested the symbols represented traps and weapons associated with the hunt for the larger animals, also depicted on the cave walls. So again, if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that kind of, it looks geometric and it's unclear what it is. And so Bruel at least was suggesting these really are things, not really like religious symbols or conceptual symbols, but really they're trying to convey maybe trapping devices or nets or something like that. In the 1960s, a French archaeologist, André Leroy-Gorin, posited that hooks and lines were male symbols, whereas ovals and circles were female ones. And von Petzinger says in New Scientist, quote, "It's interesting that it was predominantly male archaeologists doing this work early on, and there were a whole lot of vulvas being identified everywhere," which is pretty funny. And you will see this too if you look at any of the archaeology stuff before, say, 10 years ago. Everything is of a vulva, everything is a vagina, everything is a penis, and that's kind of interesting. More recently, South African archaeologist David Lewis Williams said that hallucinogenic trips by shaman might have been the inspiration for some cave art. And that's something also that I find very exciting because, again, just like dreams would have perhaps created a common vocabulary of imagery, so too hallucinogenic experiences may also create a common, because the nature of the trip itself might create common image-making tendencies. All right, brief momentary detour here again. Still very much, I suppose, related to what we've been saying, but I find this a very interesting question from the aesthetics point of view, which is really what is the meaning of abstraction and what are the cognitive implications? So here, I just quickly drew this to kind of show to raise the point. If you look at the center of this image, you have this I did a little line drawing of an animal of some kind. It says 35,000 years ago. So that we clearly have representational artwork 35,000 years ago. What's really weird is that there's sort of two lines, that one can be drawn backward through time and the other forward through time, where you arrive at non-representational pattern making. And as you know, if you just sort of tell an aesthetics view of art, you get this kind of story where you have the cave paintings, and then you just have the march of representational art all the way up to the 20th century when everything gets broken apart and we get the rise of non-representational artwork, either the expressivism of emotional artwork or the purely formal exploration of line and color and shape that you see in artists like Mondrian and Kandinsky and so forth. So in other words, art is the story of representation until you get to the very recent 20th century. Now, that story is usually told as the story of cognitive sophistication, because it was only until the 20th century that people stopped trying to represent reality and actually started to explore line and the inner feelings independently of external objects. Fine and good, except all this evidence coming from 60,000 years ago could be a very upsetting counterexample to that sort of progressive view of aesthetics, because what it shows is that some kind of non-representational art maybe was there at the very beginning of mark making. And so I just find that very exciting and strange. I don't really know what to make of it, and it's something to really think about. Okay, enough said on that. Now that I've introduced sort of aesthetics, let me just take a quick, let me just point out another area that I think is really important, because a lot of people who are doing work in this area, and I've met a lot of these people more recently, and they're very interested in image making, but a lot of them do not make art. I've noticed this. And actually a lot of people in imagination studies too, in philosophy and in the humanities, also don't engage in creative art making. Now, that's not necessarily a fatal flaw, but it is kind of important that you do some of the problem solving of creativity, image making, in order to really understand it well from a phenomenological and practical point of view. For example, I was talking with some medieval manuscript scholars, and they're very interested in imagery that's written in the sort of marginalia of these medieval manuscripts, and some of it's very strange and symbolic and hard to decode. And we were all sitting around looking at this stuff, and I draw all the time. I draw every day, and I use different implements, and in particular, I have a lot of experience with various sort of pen and ink techniques, which the manuscript illustrators would have been, the illuminated manuscript illustrators would have been using. And I know what it means to charge your pen or writing implement with the ink. It's difficult to get it in there. It's difficult to then, you have to basically sort of do doodles and squiggles in order to get the excess ink out of it so that it's in the right balance of not too much and not too little ink in order to start doing a nice clean line. And what I could see clearly were doodle marks of that variety, basically just practical artist markings to solve this practical problem. But the people who in the room who don't draw did not see that at all. They were like, what does this mean? This could be a very meaningful little image. And they were trying to decode it as a representation or something else. And so these kinds of considerations, I think, are important. Along that line, here are two images. Here are two paintings that I did in the last year. The one on the left is an oil painting, and the one on the right is a watercolor painting. And the image on the left is basically what's called an alla prima technique, which means you paint it sort of all at once in the first, attempt. And the one on the right is called the indirect technique. And so the main difference is that on the left, you cannot build up layers of paint when you're using oil paint unless you let the paint dry for days at a time. And so what happened when oil paint became the dominant mode after, if you look at Renaissance art, it's tempera paint and not oil paint. It's basically, you can layer things. And so that's called the grisaille method. And what you do is you do a black and white value painting, and then you lay these very thin glazes over the top, which dry quickly, and it works great. But when you got the oil painting, it stays wet too long to do that. And so what evolved is a different technique. And if you look at the image on the left, you'll see that in the foreground, there's some kind of, I don't know what it is. It's like a fountain architectural detail. And then the buildings behind that. And then you see trees behind that and sky behind that. But when you paint it, you can't paint it that way. You have to literally paint everything at one time. So the foreground and the background are painted sequentially just by indications of where the edges meet each other. And in other words, if you look at the very center of this image on the left-hand side, you'll see a fountain, and then there's a bush behind it, and then a house behind that. If the way reality is structured is you would lay down the house, you would paint the house first, and then after that dried, you would paint the bush, because that's closer to you, and after that dried, you would paint the architectural fountain last, because that's closer to you. And that's exactly what you do in a watercolor painting, like you see on the right-hand side with an indirect technique. You can paint it in layers because it dries quickly, and you paint the background first, and then you paint the middle ground on top of it, and then you paint the foreground in front of that. And those are two very different representational schools that are both trying to recreate sight or perception, visual perception. And that, I think, is just very exciting, because if you're not an artist and you don't make art, you won't realize what a strange and complicated process it is to recreate reality or an image. I mean, you think, you see pigs running around, and even in these cave paintings, and then there's hunters chasing them or whatever. Yeah, you just look at it and you reproduce it. It's way more complicated than that because of how you have to solve issues of figure and ground and space. And now it's true that a lot of this old stuff is very two-dimensional, and you don't have a lot of foreshortening, but you do have interesting attempts to convey motion. And that, I think, also is a place for philosophers and psychologists and evolutionary psychologists to really dig in. And I think very little work has been done on it. All right, again, I'm always switching back and forth here. Here's from a hike I did in New Mexico. This is the Three Rivers petroglyph site. And these are from anywhere between 1000 and 1400 AD. So generally speaking, before Europeans have arrived in the Americas. And so we see a pictorial representational system here that is nonetheless something we can read pretty clearly. It has all the charm of European art. It's amusing. It's interesting. It's beautiful. We know what it is. We see animals that seem to be shot with arrows or spears. We see creatures that could be lizards, but maybe therianthropes, maybe mixtures or mashups. It raises that question I raised earlier. How could imagery like this be so familiar to us and be so similar to the European tradition when Europeans had not arrived yet in the Americas? What is it indicating to us about the universality of representation? And again, we can consider this same question. Is this something about the mind that produces symbols in an environment, or could we argue that Homo sapiens that crossed the Bering Land Strait, back, 15,000 years ago, and entered the Americas and then spread through the Americas very rapidly, did they carry with them this older pictorial tradition? And is the common pictorial images that we're seeing here simply vestigial of the same tradition that emerged in Europe, going all the way back to either Africa or some, similarly ancient tradition, maybe one that evolved in Asia. It's unclear, but incredibly compelling and interesting. And any of the philosophical questions about semantics, semiotics, that are applied to language seem to me to be relevant here as well. All right, so now I'm just going to, in what remains, do a much more contemporary kind of consideration of image making, and show you that some of these questions still remain and other fresh ones emerge, because now we've got really a modern mind, one that's contoured by language and therefore probably going to be substantially different. But what are the similarities with, a pre-modern mind? So here are some images from the medieval tradition. Scivias is an illustrated work by Hildegard von Bingen, completed in 1151, describing 26 religious visions she experienced. It's the first of 3 works she wrote describing her visions, the others being Liber Vitae Meritorum and De Operatione Dei. The title comes from the phrase Scia vias Domini, know the ways of the Lord. And the reason why I'm really intrigued by this is just what are the representational conventions here? Obviously, the Renaissance sort of rediscovers perspective, and you get the sense of spatial depth that the medieval work lacks, entirely. But also, look how, this is kind of amazing. This imagery, which has this crazy tentacles coming down on the woman, is actually an image of Hildegard von Bingen herself being inspired by the light, by the divine light, to do her poetry and her images and her music. And so what would look like strange biological tentacles onto her head is in fact an attempt to convey a divine light, a spiritual light, some kind of noumena. And anyway, I just find this fascinating and intriguing. And how much of this can be read independent of cultural awareness, and how much of it requires the sort of idiosyncratic cultural awareness to make sense out of it, which is partly the question all the way back to those pictorial symbols, the 36 cave symbols in Europe. Here, I think you can see that you need a lot of cultural awareness to make sense out of this. This is just one example from Hildegard's compendium of imagery, and these were seen by her in mystical visions, and then she would try to represent them in her art. So here's the cosmic egg from her, and you see, I don't know how you could just naively read this thing, but it does certainly have some impact on you if you don't know what it is. But At the center of it, you see a kind of moving water and sand. That's the source of cosmic motion and the symbol of human beings and their crucial significance to the macrocosm. This is how she explains it. Then that's surrounded by a kind of membrane containing cosmic storms. So this is a picture of the universe. It's a metaphysical image of the whole world. And then there's sort of ether here, and then a fire element and celestial fireballs surrounding that. So this is a picture of the cosmos itself, all conveyed within an image. Fast forward here slightly to the Renaissance period, and John Dee, famous sort of alchemist, scientist, and mystic, developed something he calls the Monus Hieroglyphica, and there it is, 1564, where he's combined a series of geometric shapes, and he's trying to, as he says, he's trying to find something that teaches without words. So John Dee intended the monad to incorporate a wide range of mystical and esoteric concepts. This complex symbol was meant to symbolize the unity of all creation, influenced by astrological and planetary forces. Dee believed it held the essence of alchemical transformation and spiritual growth. By meditating on the monad, he thought to gain insights into hidden knowledge about the universe, transcending language barriers and tapping its profound truths. Overall, Dee's intention was to encapsulate his interconnected worldview, combining elements of astrology, alchemy, mysticism, and metaphysics. All of this is part of the Hermetic tradition from the ancients all the way to the present, which says, as above, so below. In other words, this is the sort of shadow tradition that's happening alongside of the development of Platonic, Judeo-Christian traditions. It has Platonic elements, and the Neoplatonic Gnostics and so forth are here, but it was the secret tradition in the Renaissance and continues to be part of, the sort of Hermetic white magic traditions that we have around today. I'd find it fairly exciting because it's not obvious how to interpret some of this, and do you need a secret society, to help you read it, or is all that just a kind of bullshit and playful attempt to achieve some kind of, Gnostic elitism, culturally speaking. All right. This gets me to think a lot about didactic imagery. And here, I've said more on this in other places, but I just remind us of John Amos Comenius, a great unappreciated Czech philosopher who really did try to create a kind of picture of the world, or a collection of pictures of the world, which would not just help kids learn about the world, because it was part of education, but also sort of convey really important information in condensed packets that were largely pictorial, though oftentimes supplemented with names, the kind of sort of classifying names that eventually somebody like Linnaeus would make so important, but these are sort of pre-Linnaean. And then in the scientific revolution, images had a very interesting role. They were both crucial in someone like Robert Hooke, but also, as Hooke pointed out, they were also very much ambiguous and threatening or dangerous. Why were they dangerous? Well, there is a sort of iconoclastic tradition about imagery, but Hooke is saying something else here. Hooke very famously said, quote, "The pictures of things which only serve for ornament or pleasure, or the explication of such things as can be better described by words, is rather noxious than useful, and serves to divert and disturb the mind and sways it with a kind of partiality or respect," end quote. So Hooke thought, following Descartes, the senses can be liars. Be careful of imagery. Despite that, he produced remarkable images for micrographia in 1665. That tradition was continued and even amplified by Alexander von Humboldt in the 18th century. Humboldt's Naturgemälde was a way of capturing enormous amounts of information within a map or an image. And so this is from his Naturgemälde of Chimborazo in Ecuador. And he's depicting the volcanoes in a kind of cross-section with detailed information about plant geography and climate, showing the interrelationship between these things in a kind of almost like a kind of big data ecological viewpoint, very holistic. And von Humboldt said, quote, "I want to appeal to the reader's imagination because the world likes to see." And I find that also incredible and valuable. So what is it then beyond words? What are we getting in imagery that's of value? Is there anything images give us that cannot be better communicated with words? I want to suggest, two things. This is not an exhaustive list, but I remind people here about the 7 affective systems that you find in people like my former teacher, Jaak Panksepp, and people like Mark Solms in South Africa, looking at the emotional systems as basically inherited, conserved mammalian systems. And I'm bracketing out here the more recent research by people like Lisa Feldman Barrett. I generally find her view to be unpersuasive. It works very well at the highest levels of the human mind, one that's already heavily shaped by language and culture, but it doesn't apply to the lower kinds of emotion that we experience too, and that would have been part of our evolved equipment. And I don't think the work by Feldman Barrett is compelling in terms of the neuroscience either, but that's a different discussion. All right, so what are the 2 ways that I think images are particularly helpful? One is memory enhancement. On the right-hand side of the slide, images that activate one of the 7 affective systems are powerfully salient and quickly recalled. So images are very close to the emotions. And so using them to communicate then you get great emotional activation. 2, it's a kind of hot cognition lingua mentis. I mean, maybe this is just another way of saying, the first one, but I do think it's not just about memory. Memory is crucial here. Just quick aside, maybe it's worth mentioning that I'm increasingly inclined to think that memory and imagination are not distinct powers, and that's another relevant issue. But all right, back to this second one, a hot cognition lingua mentis, ? Imperative semantic content more easily processed by system 1 cognition. The image is less abstract than the word, so we don't need to translate the visual sign to its meaning in the same way we need to convert a word. In other words, images create meaning by perceptually induced resonance, a kind of contagion. Following the sort of, this distinction between system 1 and system 2 cognition that somebody like Daniel Kahneman has made very famous. It precedes Kahneman, but I think that images really do reside in this fast, quick system 1 form of cognition, where you don't have the intervention of a linguistic reflective system. And that I think is an important point. All right, just to try to get to the end of this, image reading and embodied cognition. Here I'm trying to deliver a little more on this point about how images are closer to the body, and they have a kind of semantic, they have a different kind of semantic system, one of simulation and contagion rather than a representational symbol and then a correspondence theory of truth. So here's the kind of map that you find on the left-hand side in Panksepp's work. I've always found this rather compelling, where you have a distinction between primary process emotions or raw affects at the bottom, but that is incorporated and conserved in secondary process learning, sort of underwritten by, the limbic system, areas of the brain. This is where conditioning occurs, but also retains some of that really low-level vertebrate processing that you see in animals we would call sort of fear, fight or flight, but then that gets attached to perceptions and sort of conditioned learning. And then that is taken up by tertiary process cognitions at the top here, where the neocortex and reflective thinking and even symbolic thinking and culture can also then sort of incorporate those affective systems. So if we take fear at the bottom, which is fight or flight, then the animal learns what in this environment it should be afraid of through experience. And then in human beings, you have cognition and culture of what we would call horror, where you have Edgar Allan Poe and Stephen King and a whole culture like this. So these are very much related and part of, I think, our evolutionary sort of inheritance. And what I think is that in images, whether it's Hildegard von Bingen to cave paintings, these semantic layers are there. And what I think you're doing in the imagination is you're taking this material and you're doing mashups with it. So, as on the far right-hand side here, here's a drawing that Leonardo does of a dragon attacking a lion. And Leonardo says the trick to good imaginative work is that while the whole creature could be fantastical or fanciful, the individual parts of it need to be very close to reality. So the wing of this thing is going to look very close to a bat wing. The leg of this dragon needs to look very much like a quadruped. The head and neck should look very much like a snake of some kind. So there's a sense in which the imagination works well if you can combine the affordances well, or the sort of perceptions well. And you see this here in the middle image here. I've got this drawing of the face hugger from the Alien series, which strikes me as a wonderful mashup of a spider and a snake, two phobias that almost all human beings universally are frightened by or retain. So, all right, knowledge and images here. One, let's sort of show what are the forms in which images might be forms of knowledge. One, image making boosts morphological insight. This was the thing that Goethe was always on about, that you can understand form and formative process by drawing a plant, a tree, an object, a chair. So you really will understand the shapes, the forms of things better. And in that sense, image making is a form of investigation and coming to know the world. And some people, the sort of strong version of this is wonderfully stated. Some people have attributed this to Goethe. I find it, I can't find the source of it, but some have suggested that Goethe said, I do not understand what I have not yet drawn. And that strikes me as very important. Number two, images act as gestalt-like networks of affordances or use scaffolds. So you can't, as I was saying here before with monsters and fantasy and horror, the same is true about any kind of image making. You can basically condense a lot of uses and affective states within a good drawing. For example, like really obvious cases are cutaway drawings, where you'll actually show both the outside and the inside of an object. And just as an aside, I know the Chinese were fascinated by cutaway images when Europeans brought them to China. Number three, images act as inferential prediction structures for analogical reasoning and prototype classification. This is how to explain this sort of quickly. I think once you know once you can see part of a drawing, if you have enough image experience, you can infer things about the unseen parts of the drawing. You can also use the images as a way of conveying other things, like metaphorically and analogically. So if you combine one object within another, you have ideas of containment. that could be really relevant for prototype classification, like this creature is a mammal, and that can be indicated by drawing one animal within a larger shape, a box, even literally. But also Venn diagrams strike me as a kind of inferential prediction structure that's based on imagery. 4, images capture and retain somatic evaluative content. I've been sort of suggesting that here for the last few slides. I'm calling this affective chunking, where a lot of emotional information and sort of somatic information generally about approach and avoid can be contained within the image. 5, and this is interesting too, which is understanding via the kinetic drawing process is a form of sense making that capitalizes on the embodied simulation system that we share with other mammals. So creating or making takes you through, via mimicry, some aspect of the entity's causal history. In other words, making is a kind of efficient causation. So back to this, in a way, this is sort of like back to, sort of point 1 and 2, that when you draw a chair or an object, you are, in a sense, engaged in a replication or a simulation of the production process of that object. And that means you are grasping something about the causal history of that object. So I think causal information can be attained. And it's interesting that Comenius, when he had kids drawing, wanted them to draw the objects, but also just copy the drawings that he had in his book. And so there is something about trying to draw something that tells you something about the causal history of the object, or not always, obviously, but in some cases. All right, last slide here. Something maybe just worth throwing in here at the end is a bit of a tree, my own sort of idiosyncratic evolutionary tree of cognition, and where I would place image making in relation to other kinds of cognition on this tree. And this is obviously somewhat speculative, and I don't have dates on it, but I think you can generally see the sort of progress here. So let's start at the bottom, and you'll see on the left-hand side the forms of cognition in blue, and then I think sort of the expressions of that cognition and therefore the evidence of it on the right-hand side. So if you look on the left-hand side, I think the earliest forms of cognition are associational. These are going to be imperative signals and affordances. I'm sort of calling these biosemantic elements. And the way that's all going to get worked out is through mirror neurons, memory, emotional contagion, something like a task grammar. You see this in the middle I'm describing, that would have developed through extractive foraging, like you see in primates and other mammals. Then on the right-hand side, this would have been expressed in, it would have been in a sort of feedback loop with gestures, images, eventually words, dreams. Then you move up from there to sort of mythopoetic cognition. And here you see the burgeoning, the development of imagination, analogy and metaphor mapping, memetics, narrative scaffolding. This would be the rise of storytelling on the right-hand side there. You see it very much in animism, in early forms of spirituality, religion, shamanism. Up from there, you get what I'm calling sort of prosaic cognition or indicative signals, where you're just describing the world or mapping or modeling the world with denotative description. Now you get the rise of abstract concepts, nemocentric or depersonalized perspective. This is the sort of the rise of the modern mind, to sort of use the phraseology, and then it's perhaps its most articulate expression would be much more recently, since the scientific revolution. Really since Aristotle, you get the rise of sort of scientific thinking and a form of hypothetical deductive cognition. And finally, I just sort of threw this on top for sort of zombie cognition, meaning sort of computational Boolean systems, where you get neural net algorithmic cognition, which I don't even know if I want to call that cognition, but it's really the last step, or the further step, maybe from these, when you have symbolic representational systems and some kind of task grammar, some kind of binary grammar, you get sort of what looks like cognition or problem solving. All right, so that's a lot, and that's probably a good place to stop. And this is really way too much for any one project to take on, but it really maps a lot of my own interests in image making. All right, good enough.